Welcome back to PSY 235 Social Psychology. In this video, we'll be covering Learning Objective 4.3, in which you'll be learning about attribution theory, which will help us to explain how we make judgments about why people do what they do. What this area of research really deals with is what we call causal attributions. They're answers to the question we have multiple times a day: why did that person do that? So I was at the grocery store this morning, and I don't know why I continue to put myself through going to the grocery store on Sundays, because it's super busy, and I end up finding that irritating. Here's a classic example of why I get irritated at the grocery store on Sundays. You know, I'm going down the aisle, there are lots of people, and there's that one person who parks their cart on the right-hand side of the aisle, and then they walk over to the left-hand side and just start perusing products, and they're blocking the entire aisleway. That is so irritating to me. And I'm like, why would you do that? Why block the entire aisle? Take your cart with you so other people can go around you. Or, look at the products from across the aisle. Don't block the entire aisle. What am I doing there? I'm saying, why are they doing that? And I'm making an inference. Maybe my inference is less than charitable. Like, what a rude person blocking the entire aisle. Don't they see that all these other people are waiting for them? Or it could be, wow, they've removed a product that they really like and they can't find it. Darn it. Regardless of which attribution you come up with, you're coming up with a causal explanation for why people do what they do. And that provides us with information that helps us do all kinds of things. In particular, it helps us infer what their traits and characteristics are, what their emotions are, in addition to how they might behave next. Because that's critical. You know, if you're out in the social world, out in the wild, as they say, we depend on our capacity to predict and understand why people do what they do to keep ourselves safe, to keep ourselves positively engaged in our social environment. This helps us understand our social world and the people who make it up, and to predict what's likely to happen in that very messy social space. So when we're trying to decide what causes people to do what they do, Fritz Heider, argued that there are two basic kinds of judgments that we make, and then there are some subtle variations to both kinds. But generally speaking, you have a couple of broad choices. First is internal. When I am in the grocery store and somebody is blocking the aisle and appears to be utterly unconcerned about the back of carts and people who can't get around them, my tendency, if I haven't had enough coffee yet that day, is to say, this person is selfish and inattentive. If I'm really in a bad mood, I might go farther. Both of those are examples of internal dispositional attributions. I've gone straight to this person's personality. They don't care that they're blocking the way, and so on. I could, however, make an external or situational attribution. Perhaps Giant Eagle has yet again moved things around in the store and they can't find a favorite product. I actually had this happen where my usual brand of a particular product is no longer being offered, so it took me a while searching a particular set of shelves to determine that it just wasn't there anymore. And while that was happening, I may or may not have been in other people's way. My reason for why I did it was purely situational. I could look at another person in the same way. Now you can kind of test yourself. If you're shown a picture of a person who doesn't have anywhere to live, maybe they're on the street, as this particular picture shows, and what you can see in the picture is a person wrapped in a tarp with a cup. They appear to be in a wheelchair on the street, and it's raining. So you make some inferences. You can ask yourself the question, why is this person in this situation? And there are lots of possible inferences that you could make. if you make the inference that this is a person who doesn't have anywhere to live, if you make the inference that this is a person who is quite poor, and perhaps the cup is for begging, you may say to yourself, why are they in this situation? Well, maybe they have psychological problems. Maybe they are drug addicted. Maybe they are just lazy. All of those are things that are tied to internal attributes. You may, on the external side, go to making judgments like perhaps they lost their job and now have nowhere to live. Perhaps they had a major illness and lost all of their resources. Maybe there was a natural disaster and they lost their home and they just don't have the funds to replace it. All of those judgments are external to the person. So we'll start with Fritz Heider's model and these two basic forms of attributions. And I know I've shown you these before, but you need to be reminded of them yet again. Internal attributions involve inferring that a person is acting the way they are because of who they are. So their attitudes, their character, their personality. Given, TikTok is what it is. I saw this video of there was a protest going on, as, we so often see protest videos right now. And a man storms onto a bridge and starts ripping down the protesters' signs. Now, how do you make attributions about that? It depends on, your point of view. If you are a person who opposes the protest and the values, beliefs, attitudes of the protesters, you could infer that he is righteously taking personal risks, bravely going out and tearing down the signs. If you're in favor of the protest, you may say, that guy's a jerk and probably a criminal and a hothead who can't control his temper, and he's destroying our property because he's a bad person, right? So all of those, regardless of their quality, are internal attributions. External attributions, on the other hand, are inferences that the person is doing what they're doing because of the context, because of the situation. So you would, instead of going straight to personality, character, or attitude, you would have to look at the social context that the person is in. Now, it may be something that person has experienced. It may be just the whole social context surrounding them. Let's say that you are shown a video of some concert footage, and in the crowd, a little scuffle breaks out, and maybe one person is really, really, really behaving badly. There are possible external attributions there. Perhaps the person was, bumped hard, pushed hard, and they are pushing back. That is, in fact, an external attribution for a person, start getting into a fight. If they are pushed, if they are punched, if they are treated badly, they may react in kind. And that provides you with an external explanation. There was one video going around recently on TikTok of this concert goer who really pretty viciously attacked another concert goer, quite literally punched her lights out, and it was a bigger guy, and he hit a person so hard she was unconscious before he was kind of wrestled away from others. Now, the immediate, and some would argue accurate, attribution is this guy is a super uber jerk and a criminal, and he deserves to be arrested. In fact, he was. And other people sort of jumped online and said, yeah, I know that dude, and he's not a good dude. It could, in fact, be, however, there could be a whole bunch of external explanations for similar events. The fact of the matter is, in lots of these situations, we do not have access to accurate information. And Heider's expectation was that people would tend to go internal, to make internal attributions, until they're provided with enough contrary information that they have no choice but to buy the situational explanation. So let's look a little bit more in depth into the attribution process. So the type of attribution that we make is always possible, but as I just said, Heider felt that we have a tendency to really lean in the direction of the internal. Now, this is particularly true in the Western world. In Western Europe, the US, Canada, we have a strong tendency to assume that what people do is a direct reflection of who they are, and that requires an internal explanation. We tend to be perceptually focused on other people. Even in so-called Eastern cultures, so most of the research, I've talked about this before, has been done in Japan, China, in countries like India and Pakistan. There's still a bias in the direction of internal explanations, but it's not as strong as what we tend to see in the United States. And one of the things that we know is that people do tend to focus on what they are seeing in front of them or what they are hearing directly in their environment. And that's what we notice. So we tend to be, it's called perceptual salience. We tend to see people as the focal point of our perceptions. The most salient thing in our sphere is the person we're seeing. So we tend to be focused on the person, not the context, until we have a good reason for doing so. The situation in that if we're talking about making inferences about why people do what they do, is often hard to see and describe. Now, it's a bit more common in non-Western cultures for people to be much more attuned to the social context, to look at the external for explanations. Regardless of cultural context, there's always a tendency to drift toward the internal. Some cultures are just more strongly focused in that direction than others. Now, Kelly proposed what's called the covariation model, and students historically have trouble with this model. I'm going to try and present it carefully, hopefully to get around some of the confusion. Kelly talked about the idea that we try to find some basic categories of information to help us make accurate attributions about other people, but it's in a very specific context. He wants to kind of document how do we do this when we have access to a good amount of information about people. And he argues that behavior tends to vary over time, place, people, and the targets of their interactions. And the more information we know, the more precise our attributions can be, and it can also give us sort of a formula for determining whether people are going to go with an internal attribution or an external one. So this model, it basically states that to make an attribution about the cause of someone's behavior, we're going to take note of the presence or absence of various factors that help us to make those causal determinations. So what are these types of information? Covariation depends on three basic kinds of information. Consensus information has to do with normative behavior in your social context. So it's to what extent do people, other people, not the person you're looking at right now, but other people, do they behave the same way toward the same stimulus, or in other words, with the same person or in the same social context as the person you're trying to understand. Then there's distinctiveness information. So it's over here on the right side of the graphic. Distinctiveness information is about the degree to which this person whose behavior you're trying to explain behaves this same way in different contexts, in different social contexts. And then consistency information, which is in the middle of the graphic, this is information about the degree to which the person whose behavior you're trying to decode, behaves the same way across time with that same stimulus, that same situation. So here's a concrete example for you. Let's say that you have a neighbor. Let's call him Joe because I'm not feeling very creative this morning. And you're looking out your front window and you see Joe out in his front yard picking up sticks from a recent storm. Unnecessary detail. And Joe, a dog comes up to him and he hauls off and kicks the dog. You have some choices to make. But it's going to depend on what kind of information you know about Joe. So, consensus. Do other people behave like this toward that dog? So it has to be about that dog, not dogs in general. Everybody's going to say, no, kicking dogs is bad. But what about that dog? Do other people in the neighborhood have a history of negative interactions with that dog? Right? That's consensus information. What about distinctiveness? Has Joe been known to be aggressive with other dogs? Not just this dog, but other dogs. And then consistency. Has Joe had negative interactions, violent interactions, with this particular dog? Right? And the pattern of decisions, whether they're high or low on each of these three factors, is going to determine whether you make an internal attribution, Joe is a hateful dog abuser, or it's the dog. The dog is hostile aggressive, and when he gets loose, he makes a beeline and goes after people, right? So then it's external. It's not about Joe. It's about the dog and the dog getting loose and doing harm to other people, right? So this assumes you know a lot of information. You know who Joe is. You know his usual behavior across time. You know the consensus behaviors of other neighbors with respect to that particular dog. You know how Joe behaves in other situations with other dogs. You know a lot, and when you do, you can make these judgments fairly accurately. Now, in order to make an internal attribution, consensus has to be low, so other people don't kick this dog. Distinctiveness has to be low. Joe's been known to kick other dogs. And consistency has to be high. When this dog has wandered into Joe's yard, he has been aggressive with the dog. That means Joe is a mean, dog-hating person, and he needs to be stopped. To make an external attribution, however, consensus needs to be high. Other people have had altercations with this dog and have had to defend themselves. Distinctiveness has to be high. This person doesn't behave this way, so Joe doesn't have any negative interactions with other dogs. And consistency has to be high. Joe has had these bad interactions with this dog in the past. That leads to an external attribution. It's an aggressive dog. Somebody really ought to do something about that. So there are a variety of paths that you can take to either internal or external attributions using the model, using Kelly's model. And your authors give you a different concrete example, similar to this one. The boss keeps yelling at Hannah. Is it something about who your boss is? That would be the internal attribution, or something external to your boss. Maybe it's something about Hannah. And in this case, you're trying to make inferences about the boss's behavior. Why is the boss yelling? And you can see different patterns. So if you have low consensus, low distinctiveness, and high consistency, that tells you something about the boss and his personality. Maybe he's a hothead or a bully. If there's high consensus and Hannah gets on everybody's nerves and other people yell at her, if it's high distinctiveness, the boss only yells at her, and it's high consistency, the boss has yelled at Hannah in the past, then it's external. It's really something about Hannah. If, on the other hand, you have consensus is high, but there's variability in distinctiveness, that can lead to some mixed impressions. It can become, under those situations, very hard to decide what to do. If you have mixed information about the boss, in this case, you may be leaning in either a low distinctiveness or a high distinctiveness direction. In that situation, you may just be confused and not make an attribution at all. Some people will just ignore that kind of inconsistent information and go straight for an internal attribution, because that tends to be the default position. And that leads us to what's called the fundamental attribution error. And this is the tendency to infer that what people are doing corresponds pretty directly to who they are, to their personalities, in other words, their dispositions. This is sometimes referred to in the literature as the correspondence bias. This error is very, very pervasive. You know, I mentioned that grocery store kind of incident where somebody's blocking the aisleway. I have caught myself doing this in the past. I work very hard to avoid it. But I have caught myself seeing the same person weekend after weekend who tends to make these choices to get in other people's way. See, notice the language? I'm already making the fundamental attribution error, inferring that they're choosing to make other people miserable. And I will, in fact, skip an aisle just to avoid them. That's the fundamental attribution error. Adopting an error of curiosity can help you to overcome it, if you choose to. So basically, what we're doing when we fall into the fundamental attribution error, it's very low effort thinking. You know, what you see is what you get, is the old adage. So we're acting like personality psychologists who say what you're doing, it must be tied to an underlying personality trait. Social psychologists, on the other hand, want to really pay attention to social situations as opposed to internal factors. What Kelly was really pointing out with the covariation model is that doing accurate attribution work requires an investment of energy. It requires time, and it requires information. We make micro judgments. We make thousands of attributions a day. You may think that I'm making that up, but unless you are sitting at home and going nowhere and not on social media at all, not even watching television, unless you're locked down and have no contact with the outside world, you are engaging with people one way or the other, and you are decoding their behavior. Usually, because our default position is a little bit attributionally lazy, our default is going internal and saying people do what they do because of who they are, not because of the situation that they're in. So why does the fundamental attribution occur in the first place? Well, perceptual salience comes into play. People tend to focus on people. You know, think about all those little video clips that you watch on TikTok of people doing things. Sometimes it's funny things, ridiculous things, stupid things, mean things, horrible things. And you have to make judgments. Those videos tend to focus on the person, not the context. So the person that you're watching is the biggest thing on the screen. That makes them even more perceptually salient, and it becomes our focus of attention. If you're having a conversation with someone, they are your focus of attention. Even if you're in a crowded, busy party or a sporting event or whatever, the people immediately near you are the focus of your attention. And when we're focused on the person, we tend to drift in the direction of making internal attributions. So perceptual salience is a big predictor of making internal attributions. When we can force people to switch their attention to the external, to the context, they tend to be somewhat less likely to make those internal judgments. Now I'll put this up on the screen. You can read about it in more detail in your text. I kind of put the image up here so that you'll know to go back to the book and read about this study, because it really shows how if you manipulate the degree of perceptual salience, like the highest degree of perceptual salience is going to be when actor A and actor B are directly across from one another. They're able to see each other's whole bodies and faces. If, however, you move them around and put them in different positions, it can alter the degree to which a target whose behavior needs to be interpreted is perceptually salient. And what these researchers documented was, predictable changes in the kinds of attributions that were made. So go in and read that description on your own. It's fairly complicated on the surface, but once you kind of wrap your head around it, it makes a lot of sense to explaining the role of perceptual salience. Now, another way of thinking about the attribution process is in what's called the two-step model of attribution, or two-step process of attribution. This graphic from your text kind of lays it out for you. You have a behavior that you're trying to explain. So you're sitting in class, professor asks a question, the kid in the front of the class gives a completely wrong answer. You are like, you make an internal attribution about that student. Maybe they didn't do their homework because they're lazy, or they're not very smart, whatever. Step 2, it's going to be, if you have the time, you're going to think harder. You're going to think harder, look more at the situation, think about yourself across situations, times when you've made mistakes. If you haven't stopped at step 1 and then jumped down to make the attribution, maybe you're distracted, maybe you're tired, maybe you're just not motivated to move on to step 2, you're going to stop there and live with your internal attribution. So the default position, when you see that behavior, you see the student make the wrong answer, and you say, wow, that was really dumb. And if there isn't a good reason, or if you don't have the energy or the time, you're going to stick with that internal attribution and say to yourself something uncharitable like, what a doofus. I wouldn't make that kind of mistake. If you have the time, though, if you are motivated, you go to step 2. So you're going to think of other possible explanations. Maybe, if you're given the time, you think about who the professor is. Was the question fair? Was the student actually kind of right? Is the professor being mean? Was the question unanswerable? All kinds of things are possible there. If you get through step 2 and say, yeah, it wasn't really about the student whose answer was wrong, it was more about this guy with the flaming hair, and you adjust your initial attribution taking into account all of these other possibilities. So this two-step process, you'll engage in step 2, which is shifting to effortful controlled processing, if you consciously make yourself slow down and think carefully, if you're motivated to be as accurate as possible, and 3, if you're suspicious that the behavior of the target person, the person whose behavior you're trying to explain, if you think maybe they are play acting, that they're managing their impression, they're putting a version of themselves out there for effect. So, for example, I've been teaching for a super long time. I've had occasion to have, not often, thank the Lord, disruptive students. So I've had the occasional, there was one situation in particular that I remember vividly, where there were a couple of first-year students. They sat in the back of an intro classroom, and they appeared to be making it their mission to make the professor miserable. In this case, I was the supervisor. I was the department chair, and it was one of my part-time faculty members teaching this class. And these kids had been making her miserable. They were disruptive. They said things in class that were hostile to the teacher. So I wanted to sit in and see what they were doing. And, what they were doing, they were being very disruptive. They were making noise during class, getting up, leaving, coming back, banging doors. They were giggling, laughing, using their phones, doing everything they possibly could to, in my opinion, be disrespectful. Now, when I tagged these students individually and called them on the carpet for this behavior, each one of them, independently, probably would never have done anything like that. But they were feeding off of each other's misbehavior, and they wanted, as one of them said to me, I just wanted to look cool because I'm a new student. I just wanted to look cool. And I'm like, well, in college, you have to stop acting like you're 12. And he was like, you have a point. So they did a lot better after someone in authority took them aside and told them to knock off the garbage. So sometimes you may have a suspicion that a person is doing whatever they're doing for effect, for whatever reason. Now, sometimes the attributions that we make of other people and of ourselves are highly what we call self-serving. Remember those two basic human motives. We want to feel good about ourselves, and we want to feel like we can make sense of the world around us. So we want to feel like we're accurate. The first one, the wanting to feel good about ourselves, that can lead us to make what are called self-serving attributions. So when we've been successful, when something good has happened, we tend to take credit. It's because of who I am. So you get a good grade on a paper or whatever, you can say, yeah, I worked hard, but I'm also really good at this thing. I'm really good at this. Or if you do poorly, you'll say, you know what? I knew that this teacher was super hard. I knew that the exams would be super hard. Is it any wonder that I didn't do well? So we tend to take credit for good things that we've done that reflect positively on us, and we tend to deflect taking blame for other factors. And we tend to look for other situational factors that caused what happened. And sometimes we even do this preemptively. Like, I was an athlete when I was in high school, and the first couple of years of college, I had a teammate who was just a professional at preemptive self-serving attributions. He was a distance runner, and he was always anxious, just anxious human being. And he would come, he'd be on the bus, and all through the lead up to his races, he was like, I'm just not feeling well. I didn't sleep well. I didn't do this. I didn't do that. And what's he doing? He's preparing himself and everyone else for failure. Now, it didn't matter that every race, he was typically first or second. He was a very good runner, very talented. He worked very hard in training and so on. But he was preparing himself in case something went bad with an explanation that would explain away. It wasn't about his talent as a runner. It was about other things that were more transient. There are also these things called defensive attributions. When we've done something wrong, something that makes us look like we're not nice, or makes us feel like we've been stupid, we'll tend to come up with some explanations that soften it, that make it feel better, so that we feel less vulnerable and less mortal. So for example, if you're driving and like one of the worst car accidents I've had, I was on the way to work, and the sun was blazing. I'll admit to that. But I just had this moment of inattention, and I looked to the left, I looked to the right, but I didn't look to the left again. And what had happened when I made that mistake was that another driver had turned onto that street and had just gotten up to speed. Since I didn't look, I pulled right out in front of him. I got T-boned. Nobody was badly hurt, thank goodness. But my initial thoughts, as soon as I got over the immediate shock, was, oh, the sun. And even the sheriff's deputy, when he came to take the accident report, he was like, hey, the sun got you, didn't it? And I was like, yes, absolutely. It was the sun. It wasn't me being, a bad driver in that particular moment. And on my best day, I'm an adequate driver. I'm generally safe, but I'm prone to, making mistakes every now and then. So we tend to drift in that defensive space in order to protect and maintain our customary level of self-esteem. So to review here, why do we make self-serving or defensive attributions? We want to keep our self-esteem relatively positive. And what that means is we might want to distort reality a little bit by adjusting our perception of the environment. Let's say that you've had a tiff with a friend and it was due to a misunderstanding. We were watching, I don't know other families. My family isn't particularly normal, but we all got together and we watched K-pop Demon Hunter. And one of my kids said, uh-oh, it's a third act misunderstanding. So what if you've had a third act misunderstanding with a friend and you let them have it? You think they did something that was mean to you and you just let them have it. And then you find out later, oops, they didn't do it, or it wasn't what you thought it was. And then you have to come crawling back. Now, what you'll kind of do is this fancy reorganization of the facts that preserves us just enough of your self-esteem so that you don't feel like garbage, but it also allows you to deflect a little bit of blame on the other person, a little bit of situational blame, and then you can take some responsibility. So what we tend to do is try and massage those kinds of situations so that we feel okay about ourselves, but we can make amends with our friend. So we want people to think well of us. We want people to think we're good, decent, kind, and capable. What happens when we don't do those things, when we don't live up to that? We try to put our behavior, our current behavior, into a context that provides other people with external attributions and provides ourselves with them too. So what might be some reasons for why I pulled out into that intersection? Well, I could make up all kinds of things, but I could also search my morning and try and figure out why was I so distracted. And I'll find things. They may or may not be true, but I'll look for my mornings like, this is what happens when I only have 1 cup of coffee. I pull out in front of people, right? We're going to look for excuses that will help us feel better in the moment. Another reason why we make these attributions is that it's not because we're lying to ourselves and other people. We may actually believe that there are multiple factors that cause us to do what we do, and that's in fact true. Now, we know more about who we are and what's going on in our own lives and our own thinking than other people do. So we have more information. We're more likely to make balanced attributions about ourselves than we are about other people, unless we know them super well. And in that case, you will make those more balanced attributions. Another variable that is related to this is something called belief in a just world, which was proposed by a researcher named Lerner back in the 80s and 90s. And this is a defensive attribution where you're looking at situations where bad things have happened to a person or a group of people. And our tendency, according to Lerner, is to assume, and this is a culturally dependent judgment, but there is a tendency to assume that when bad things happen to people, it's because they deserve it. That, bad things happen to bad people. If you're a good person, bad things shouldn't happen to you. And, in some cases, what you're talking about is people who make stupid mistakes or bad choices. So, an example of research that looked at, and this was back in the 80s during the AIDS crisis, the initial AIDS crisis in the United States. And there were a lot of people who spun theories that people got the disease AIDS because they were having inappropriate sex, they weren't in committed relationships, they were using IV drugs, they were sharing needles. If they didn't do those immoral things, they wouldn't be sick. So the reason they're sick is because they're immoral people. So bad things wouldn't happen to us if we weren't stupid and careless. And part of what's going on here, according to Lerner, is called a belief in a just world. And it's very self-protective. So follow my logic here. We are humans, we are very vulnerable. It's always possible that bad things can happen to us. Now, in some part of our brains, we know that. We know all of us are just one natural disaster away from losing our homes or whatever. One moment of inattention, not because I'm stupid, I could have a bad car crash, whatever. Or somebody in my family could get sick. I could get sick. Bad things can happen. How do we live in a world where random bad things just happen and still keep moving through our day? Well, the argument, according to Lerner, is that we have to do some attributional fancy dancing. When we see the world, bad things happening to people in the world, it makes us feel safer and more secure if we infer that they are at least in part to blame for their fate. So, classic example of this, I grew up in a place where tornadoes happen, but then I went to grad school in Nebraska, which is on the plains. Tornadoes are just a fact of life in Nebraska. There was always this tendency on the news to report utter devastation in trailer parks when a tornado hits. So then what you would hear is people saying, well, if you have to live in a trailer park, then you deserve to get your home sucked up into a tornado. Really hostile judgment. So, loss of life, loss of property, all of those things. If you, in your manipulation of your thoughts about the world, go and say, well, if they had just made better judgments, they would have had a storm cellar. They would have been able to go into the basement, or they would have heard that the storm was coming and they would have gotten out of there. But no, they're trailer trash, right? So the way people do this is it's a desire to reaffirm their own ability to control their fate. This also translates into blaming the victim in criminal situations. So if a person has been sexually assaulted, for example, the tendency is to find out what they did to increase the likelihood of their victimization. So this is why many women are asked, what were you wearing? Where were you? How were you behaving? Were you drinking anything? And already nobody has asked anything about the person who did the sexual assaulting. So that's blaming the victim. Why do we do this? Because we don't want to feel so insecure about ourselves as to say, I am just as vulnerable as the next person to being assaulted. Doing that makes us very uncomfortable. So even though it's really awful, we tend to go for belief in a just world instead of feeling so vulnerable. So the bias blind spot, is this idea that most people understand that we can make mistakes with our attributions. We can make mistakes in judgments. But we also tend to believe we're better at avoiding those mistakes than we actually are. And this is what we call the bias blind spot. Because as we're just going through our day and we're making attribution after attribution after attribution, and we rarely get any information back to confirm that we're wrong. And I don't have any way of estimating percentages here, but we're wrong fairly often because we just get no feedback, especially if we're making attributions about strangers. We tend to believe other people make a lot more mistakes when they're making attributions than we do ourselves. It's a part of that other motive. So we've got the desire to maintain self-esteem. We want to feel smart, but we also want to feel like we're correct. So if we can go without correction of our attributions, we will tend to default to assuming we're right until we're proven we're wrong. Make sense? So that concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 4.3. Next time, we'll be looking at how cultural factors, cultural differences, cross-cultural influences, are related to social perception and attribution.